Hi everybody, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to continue looking at my game with Monokroussos-Dreev, a famous grandmaster. And this was played back in 2001 in an ICC online qualifying event. The time control was 8 minutes for the game with 2-second increments. And we left off here. White somewhat better. I had white in this game, I should add that. And it was a funny variation of the Caro-Kann. Of course, you can check out last week's show for lots of details. And let's resume from here. Now, when I left with a question, which is, I don't remember if I asked in the most general terms what I should do here, or if I asked about a particular move, which was queen takes h5. So the question really is this pawn grab a good one or not? And I'm not sure, honestly, but I certainly felt that it was very risky, and I still think it was risky. So even if with careful work with the computer I'm able to find ways for white to escape, in terms of the practical situation, it's exceedingly dangerous, and I suspect bad things would have happened. Now, this isn't what I did, so I played queen to e3. Objectively, this probably loses a good chunk of my advantage. Another decent move, by the way, is knight to a6, and after queen to d8 to play queen takes h5. And this might be the best solution of all, for a reason that we'll see. Okay, so after queen takes h5, queen f4 is the move that I was worried about. This both further cuts my queen off from the rest of my army, and I have to worry about rook to h6 in some lines. Also, of course, there's the even more direct idea of queen to c1. So I have to worry about that. My f3 and e4 pawns are a little bit looser now. So this is really, especially in kind of a glorified blitz game, this is a really scary decision to make. And as we'll see, in fact, it's objectively quite scary as well. So one possibility here, let's say I play the move rook to b1. This looks pretty logical. So I bring my rook where it covers the back rank. Okay, well now black can play a move like f5, trying to bust things open. If e5, this is possible, but it also cuts down a lot of my options. So let's try king e2. And now though, f takes e4, e4, rook f8, hitting this pawn on f2. Now, at first glance, it doesn't really seem so bad for white. White can play something like rook b to f1, for instance, or at least so it seems. But now black can really start to hammer away at me, and there's a very nice move for black here. So you might want to even see if you can find it. Well, that move is the Fischer-esque knight to a4. So you might remember the famous game of the century between Donald Byrne and Fischer, where he played knight to a4 around move 12 or 13 before making the queen sacrifice on move 17. So this works out very nicely here. He's threatening knight takes c3 check, which is quite strong. Also probably threatening just to take the knight on c5 and then play d takes e4. And if I take on a4, he plays d takes e4. Bishop c4 looks as good as anything else. And he has time to just build up here. So, well, rook to f5, threatening to win the queen. So I have to play bishop takes e6, rook e6, queen e8 check, rook f8. And I think white is just lost here. So let's say queen h5, now knight f5. And the threat is to play e3. And even after king to d1, still e3. And I think white's toast here. So this gives an idea of the dangers that are present. They don't appear all at once, but black just keeps developing his pieces to good squares and prepares these breakthroughs, and it's rather difficult for me to respond. Now, it does look like the immediate king to e2 works out pretty well, though it took quite a while for me to determine this in different engines and so on. So one early line that I looked at was f5, and I think Fritz liked rook b to b1 here. But now fe, rook f8, and again with very dangerous counterplay. So once again, let's say rook b to f1 or rook h to f1, either one. And then black can once again hammer away with knight to a4, takes on e4, And again, this is bad. The threat's rook to f5 once again. And alright, so we already saw basically what happens on bishop to c4. If bishop takes e4, then queen e4 check. And now rook takes f2 check. And this position is equal. And if it's scary for anyone, it's maybe a little bit scarier for white. However, going back to the position after king to e2, I think after f5, there were some problems with this. I don't recall what they were at this point, but white can, in fact, I think, be better. But maybe it should be double checked. So anyway, maybe black's best here is rook to g2. And then white should bail out with queen to e5. And after this exchange, white's up a couple of pawns, but black does have some compensation for them. So white's definitely better, but I've got 5 isolated pawns here, and black's pieces are all pretty active. So even though he doesn't have full compensation, he probably has at least compensation for one of them, and very good drawing chances because of my really bad pawn structure. So as a practical matter, I think it's tough to complain about the move I chose. Though again, knight to a6, that would have been the best move. So I prevent this queen f4 business, and then I can take on h5 safely. Alright, so queen to e3 is what I played. Dreev played rook to c8. Here I think e5 would have given me an edge, but I was kind of hesitant to play this. I mean, once I do this, I have to worry about the f5 square, and my pawn structure loses a lot of its flexibility. Now, as I look at it here, some years along, and with the benefit of hindsight, I wouldn't really describe my pawn structure as very flexible at all, because once I play f4, he plays d takes e4, and the f5 square is just as bad as it is after e5, but then I also have the d5 square to worry about too. So the only real drawback to playing e5 is that I'm giving up the f5 square straight away. But it also does some good things, as we mentioned last week. It prevents black's queen from coming into f4, which is very useful, and it's also opening the diagonal for my bishop on d3 towards his king side. So after e5, black's best may be knight to c4, and probably here I should just take, and then play rook to b7, and I'm a little bit better here. It's actually not that much, though. I'm a pawn up, sure, but this rook is well placed on g6. The knight can come to d5 or to f5. Maybe it goes to f5 and the black queen goes to d5 or maybe to a5. And really all of black's pieces are functioning pretty well here. So white's advantage is pretty small in this position. So after rook to c8, I chose to play king to e2. A variety of reasons for this. Of course, I'm getting out of the way of any queen takes c3 ideas if I move my knight on c5. Also, it's clearing my back ranks. That way, if I play the rook from b3 back to b1, it can then maybe swing over to g1 as well. So it's a useful move. However, I think with e5, trying to open up the center and exploit my king's position there, black would achieve rough equality. So again, this merits further analysis, but there's already so much analysis in this game that I'll have to leave that to you. Okay, instead Dreev played queen to c6. I played queen to f4, and then here he blundered, and I blundered back. So I think by and large in this game we both played pretty well, but here we definitely dropped the ball. So he played queen to c7, which is a blunder. Give you a few moments to figure out why it's a blunder. And the answer, of course, is that I could just trade queens and play e takes d5. And it's not just the second pawn that's such a big deal, but the fact that I'm threatening his rook on g6 and the simple fork with d6. And this should be a fairly easy win, even in a blitz game. So unfortunately, I missed it, and I played e5, or I trusted him. Or we were both probably in bad time pressure. I remember there was a good stretch of the game where, he was down under 5 seconds and living off the increment. And I joined him around that level at some point. I think it wasn't for quite a while. So, I probably still had a minute or two around here, but not a lot of time. And I don't remember the exact amount. I just remember that Dreev pretty quickly got down to just atrocious time trouble, but played pretty well through most of it. Okay, well anyway, after e5, I've achieved most of what I wanted, so leaving aside the blunder, I've made progress here. So he plays rook to h6, I play rook to g1, Knight to g6, takes, and now rook to b1. So I'm threatening to bring the rook over to the g file, and also, of course, I want to take the pawn on e6, but doing it right away would be a big blunder on account of queen to c4 check, and I lose my rook. So rook to b1 sidesteps that as well. Alright, so he plays queen f7, takes, and all of a sudden the game has been radically transformed. So what was once a middle game is now very rapidly proceeded into an endgame. Well, what can we say about this position? I'm a pawn up, but of course I have lots of poor pawns. Then again, so does he. So this pawn on e6 always needs to be supervised, especially with my knight on c5. This pawn on g6 and behind it the pawn on g7 are potentially weak since they're backward and on an open file, or at least a file that's open from my point of view. On the other hand, my c3 and a3 pawns aren't so great. They're shielded. They're not easy to get at for the moment, but they're still a problem for me. If his rook can get to f4, then I have to worry about my h-pawn, and also I have these pawns on an open file as well, and they too are backward. So there's plenty of pawn weaknesses to go around. Really the biggest asset that I have is, of course, that I've got this extra pawn, and that my knight on c5 is extremely strong as well. And he can't follow suit with knight to c4 without letting my rook penetrate even more deeply and dangerously into his position. And so because this idea of my rook penetrating is very strong, I therefore played the move a4, which is perfectly good. Okay, so he plays rook to b7, so that way I don't get to play a5 and rook to b7 check and start taking even more pawns, like the pawn on e6, the pawn on a7, the pawn on g7, and so on. Okay, so I played a5, and now he has a choice. So he chose the more passive knight to c8, keeping his a7 pawn protected. He could have tried knight to c4, but this is also good for me. And notice, by the way, that he has two threats here. So take a moment, see if you can figure out what his two threats happen to be in the position. One of them is pretty obvious. It's knight takes a5. But he's also threatening knight takes e5, because after d takes e5, there's rook takes c5, and then my a pawn is hanging, and my c3 pawn is hanging, and he has excellent drawn chances. Fortunately, I have a move that covers both of these pawns at once. Actually, I could play rook to b7 also, because knight takes e5 is impossible, and trading after the trade of rooks, then my knight defends the a5 pawn. So that's playable too. But it's also not bad for me to play rook to b5. And now I'd like to play f4 next. So if I can play f4, then I can play a6 and rook to b7. All of my pawns are safe and secure, and I win very easily. So black might as well try the move g5. And this idea is one that I have to keep an eye out for really through most of the rest of the game. Here, though, it's not so bad. So let's say h takes g5. And now I'm kind of threatening g6 check in some cases. So anyway, black could play rook to e7 here. Let's say f4. Okay, I'm sorry. So the point of that has nothing to do with g6 check, but has to do with the fact that black would like to play king to g6 and get his king active and start going for my guys. But if he does it right away, he's dropping the pawn on e6. So that's what rook to e7 is about. Forget the nonsense I was uttering a moment ago. Okay, well now f4 is good. King g6, rook to b8. And here I think I have everything covered. So if he takes the pawn on a5, for instance, okay, he gets the pawn, but now I play rook to f8, and his king is cut off. And, most importantly, I have the threat of knight takes e6. So if it's my move, I can play here, and now my pawns roll. And the point is that, of course, if rook takes e6, f5 check is just winning. Okay, so knight takes a5 really isn't so good for him. If he plays king to f5, trying to break through, and this is a very typical idea, and it's a great idea. The problem is that I have everything under control here, but this kind of idea of sacrificing a pawn, sometimes two pawns, but to activate the pieces is crucial. And we've talked about this in previous shows where I mentioned rook endings, and I remember I mentioned, I presented one of my rook endings that I lost because I violated that rule for a long time. And also I think rook endings where I won as well, for the same reason. So activating your rook, activating your king in rook endings and endgames in general is often just a crucial thematic element of how to play them properly. Okay, well anyway, after king to f5, a6 seems to be best. And now black has two choices, and neither of them is going to lead to satisfaction. If he plays king takes f4, the most obvious move, well, then I play rook to b7, and I had to start winning every pawn in sight. Most importantly for the moment, the a7 pawn, because that pawn becomes extremely dangerous. So actually, maybe I would take the g7 pawn first, so that way I have the g6 pawn, or my passed g pawn as well. I'm faster to fight against his h pawn if I need to. In any case, this position is winning for white. And if black prevents that with knight to a5, well, in this case I can play king to f3. And now I've safeguarded my f pawn, and I've locked his king out. So he might as well go back, and then I have rook to f8 once again with that same familiar threat of knight takes e6 followed by f5 check. So this is a terrific position for white, and I'm simply winning here. Alright, well that means that after a5, knight c4 isn't going to save black. But knight c8 really shouldn't either. And here, once again, I've got a number of good possibilities. And the move I chose wasn't so good. It didn't quite throw away the win, but it was a mistake. Anyway, figure out what white to move ought to do here. So it's a position where some very fundamental decisions can be made. See what you can come up with. So I think there are at least 3 reasonable, important moves to consider. Okay, well, a few seconds later for me, but hopefully quite some time later for you. Let's take a look. Now, one reasonable possibility is f4 to preclude the g5 option for black. So we're just going to kind of sit on the position here, make black suffer, and then win. And I think that this is actually a good move. So for example, if knight to e7, aiming for knight f5, here I can play either rook to b7 right away, or maybe even a6. a6 might actually be the very best move, but rook to b7 should be good enough to win too. So for example, takes, knight f5, and now once again an important decision for white. So if you haven't already reached and thought about this position, let me suggest that you do so now. What should I play in this position? Well, it's very tempting to play a move like knight to d6 check, trading knights, protecting the h pawn, so I don't have to worry about that anymore, and, well, liquidating. The problem is, of course, that he wins this pawn. So takes, king e8, king d3, king d7, and I'm a move too late for c4, c5. So if I play c4 here, takes, king d6, and I can't win this. In fact, it's just a pretty straightforward draw here. And both sides are prevented from breaking in. Okay, we're going back here. If I play king c2, he takes, I play here, and again, I'm locked out. So knight to d6 check would in fact be a bad move. But the right way to play is knight to d8 check. Okay, so king e7, keeping the pawn protected, but now knight to c6 check, king d7, knight takes a7, knight h4, knight b5, and we're going to actually see positions like this in the game. But this is a reasonably favorable one for white. Now, the basic trick that white has in mind is to play like this. So white wants to play a6, a7, black's king will get to b7 via c8 or via c6, and then white plays knight to c7, threatening the queen. Black takes the pawn, and then white takes on e6, and will take on g7, and so on, and try to win. So it'll still be up a pawn. Black will have a lot of weak pawns remaining on the board, and this will typically lead to a winning position for white. Okay, so let's see what this looks like in reality here. So knight to g2, for instance. Okay, a6. Black doesn't have time to take my pawn, because if he does, he loses the knight, because knight takes f4, king f3, and then his king still has to run over to stop my pawn. So king c6 right away, a7, king b7, knight c7, and I get there first. So that's the key thing. I'm threatening the queen, so he's got to take my pawn, knight e6, and f4 is protected. And I'm just going to play with king to f3, knight g7, and so on. Okay, so that was knight to g2. If he brings his king over immediately with king c6, we'll look at king c8 in a moment too, then I win like this. So a6, say king b6, a7, king b7, and now the most efficient way is rather elegant. c4, so I just break through here. I don't even need to bother with the knight to c7 stuff anymore. So c4 takes, d5 takes, and now another little finesse, knight to d6 check. So that first, king a7, e6. And so the knight on d6 stops him from playing knight to f5, and thus black cannot prevent me from queening, and so white wins. Okay, so that's what happens on king to c6. King c8 is a bit more resilient. So a6, knight g2, a7, king b7. Actually, it's not more resilient. It just transposes into the knight to g2 line, and white wins rather routinely. Okay, well, what that means then is that f4 seems to win pretty much by force. Maybe black can avoid knight to e7, but if he doesn't do that, I can continue to improve my position and then eventually play rook to b7 anyway and just win. The second probably winning line is rook to b8. Okay, so not rook to b7 just yet, but rook to b8. And now if g5, well, takes here, and now rook f8 check. So that's the point behind rook to b8. So it wasn't just some kind of funny move that wastes time. No, it had a specific purpose in mind. Okay, well now if king takes, knight e6 check wins. White's going to be up 3 pawns, which is plenty here, since the only dangerous pawn of black's, his h-pawn, can easily be stopped by my king. Okay, so king g6 is better, but it's better without being sufficient. So king to d2, so that way I don't let his rook in after I play knight takes e6. So rook c6, protecting the pawn. Now king e3, and this actually, that little tempo is favorable for me. His rook is on a weaker square, so should go back, because if he plays king g5, then there's rook f7. So that's the trick. Wait a minute. Yeah, because okay, even if he plays knight f5, then his a pawn's hanging in some lines. I think that's right. Okay, anyway, rook c7, king f4, rook c6, a6, and I've improved my position to the max here, knight c8. In fact, he's pretty much in Zugzwang here. So again, if king h7, rook f7, and I'm going to grab something somewhere pretty quickly. So alright, knight c8, knight takes e6, and thanks to c4, white breaks through and wins. So okay, this line's a little bit less clear-cut than I think the f4 variation is. So f4, I think, is the best technical move. So you simply prevent black's counterplay and then get on with your own winning ideas afterward. Instead, though, I played king to d3, which is an inaccuracy, to be sure. So the idea is that I want to be able to move my knight on c5 without having to worry about the c3 pawn hanging, and maybe play c4 in some positions as well. But I'm bringing my king in the wrong direction. I need my king near his h-pawn so that he can't get counterplay in that way. Okay, well, once again, I make another inaccurate move here. Very natural move, rook to b7, but it's not the best move. So the best move would have been a6. Now, one point behind this is if he plays knight f5, rook to b7, I can take with the pawn if he takes, and if he doesn't, well, that's okay too. So let's look at the variations here. Knight f5 is certainly the most natural way to go here. So rook to b7, rook e7. Of course, that's forced. And now some neat tricks, though. I have knight to d7 at this point. So I'm going to win his a7 pawn very quickly. So if he takes, rook a7, knight f3, rook b7, just going to push the pawn. If he Plays rook to e8. I have a simple tactic, knight f6 check, and I win his rook, and then I queen. So let's say h3, queen. And here, if he plays h2, this looks almost good at first. I mean, I guess I have queen h8 as well, so it's not really too serious. But the idea would be, maybe queen a1, knight to g1. Of course, this is all academic, though, because queen f8 mate just kills him right away. And if he tries g5 first, okay, tons of wins. Can do this, and then knight f8 check, and I just devour everything. Alright, so the point is then that he doesn't have time to grab my h-pawn here. But what else can he do? I mean, if he plays king to e8, well, I take the pawn anyway, because he's too far away from my a-pawn, and I win. Alright, so that means that after a6, black does not have time for this counterplay with knight to f5. If he plays knight c6, well now, again, I have time to make a good prophylactic move. So simply f4, and black is busted. Alright, let's say king to e7, trying to come over to the queen side to help out. Rook b7. And now he can't play king to d8 because the knight takes e6 check. If he plays rook takes, then I think I could play pawn takes here safely. He has to play knight to b8, and then I think I play c4. Oh, actually, yeah, sorry, that's my line. So here, knight to b8. And now, okay, c4 is possible. Also, just king to c2, bringing the king to b5, and then knight to a6. So that should be sufficient as well. And if black ever plays like king to d8 to go to c7, I take this one, I take this one, I play f5, and basically win everything. And then the only pawn that I have to stop is his a pawn, which is very easy for me to do. All right, so that would have been a second way to win. Instead, I played rook to b7. Now he took, I took, and knight to f5. Once again, knight to d6 check is bad, and in this case, it's just losing. Takes, g5, oops, hg, g6, and now I'm just losing because I always have to keep my king in the square of his h-pawn, and meanwhile, he just comes over and takes my d-pawn, and then he comes over here and keeps taking things while I'm busy having to stay within the square of his h-pawn. So this is losing. All right. Of course, I didn't play that. That was simple enough. So I played knight to d8 check, which is what I had counted on. King e7, knight c6, king d7, knight a7, knight h4. And now this is the last moment at which I still have a winning advantage. So once again, let me encourage you to stop the recording for a while and do the best you can with this. So you've already seen some of the key ideas, and for both sides, and it's just a matter of trying to calculate out as best as possible how white can win. So it's not simple. Well, I mean, the basic ideas are simple, but proving that it's a win is kind of tough. Okay, and I'll even give you suggestions as to the three moves that need to be examined. So one is f4, saving my pawn and preventing g5. Another is to play king to e2, bringing my king, well, protects the pawn and brings my king closer to his h-pawn. And the third idea is to play knight to b5, or actually a6. That'll probably transpose. So a6 or knight to b5 with the idea of, again, a6, a7. So have some fun analyzing that, and then when you're ready, resume the recording. Okay, well, let's take a look at f4 first of all. This does not work because he plays knight to g2. Now let's say I play knight to b5, getting on with my queenside play. Knight f4, king e3, g5. And the key thing here is that he controls f4, controls the f4 square with his knight, which means that this a7, or this a6, a7, knight c7 idea no longer does anything because the e6 pawn is protected by his knight. So here, in fact, I don't know if I'm losing here, but certainly I have nothing anymore. I'm equal at best and potentially worse. So f4 is no good. a6 and knight to b5, as I said already, should just transpose. So let's take a look at knight to b5. Okay, king c6, a6, and now black has at least three choices here. Knight to f5, knight to g2, and knight takes f3. All right, well, let's start with the move knight to g2. Now, the idea here is, again, to put the knight on f4, where it protects this pawn on e6. Okay, a7, king b7, knight c7. So the key thing is he's, again, too late. Or is he? And actually the answer is yes, because if he plays knight to f4 check, king e3, knight to g2 check, king to d2. And now he has to take on a7, knight e6, and I'm there in time. And if h4, king e2, h3, king f1, just in time. So it's not by much, but it's enough. Actually, yeah, that line might even be a little bit silly. Maybe white should just play knight. Oops, sorry. Here, white should maybe just play knight to g5. I'm not sure about that though. Maybe knight f4 refutes that idea. So, for example, if king to e3, h3 is well, okay. I don't know that it's winning, or even better, just e6. Okay, so actually maybe knight to g5 can be played as well. But I think king e2, h3, king f1 should be safe also. The only question here is whether knight to h4 is enough to save black, because he's threatening h2, so I have to play king g1. He takes, king here, and alright, well, I'm winning this pawn, and I'm threatening to then immediately ram this pawn all the way home. So this should be winning for white, but maybe should triple check for some clever finesses for black. But I'm pretty sure it's winning. So after knight to c7, if black can't play knight to f4, then he's got to take, but then knight e6. And yeah, actually this may just transpose, so that may just be a little adventure in transposition. Yep, sure enough. Okay, so I came up with the same line by different means. Okay, so if g5, knight g7 wins, again with the idea of just dragging this pawn all the way through the next few moves. So king b6 is more or less necessary. Okay, and now knight f4. So we don't bother with knight g7 and all of that now, but we fork his pawn. So we're hitting this guy and that guy. So king c6, knight g6, here, knight f4, forcing him back, knight h3, knight d2, knight f4, knight e4, king g2, knight c3. Okay, so a long line. The bottom line is that we get to a position like this. Now king f3. And I believe that white is winning here. Now, 2 versus 1 in a knight ending, you know, it'll always depend on where the pawns are. But here, I think because it's the 2 connected passed pawns, it's a win. I don't remember if I checked some kind of table base. Well, it's 7-man. There might be some 7-man table bases that will address this position. I'm not sure, but my judgment about this position is that white should be winning here. But as you see, it's very close. Okay, so that's, after a6, the move knight to g2. White wins by a small margin. At least I think he's winning. Okay, a second try is knight takes f3. So simple greed. And this is actually quite close too. So a7, king b7, knight c7. Okay, familiar ideas. h4, king e2, knight to d2. I can't take because h3 and he'll queen. So knight to f4, g5, e6. Okay, now his knight runs back just in time. And here we have some adventures. Okay, so after e7, black has a choice. He can either play h2, we both queen, or he can run home with knight to d6. And then we both stop each other from queening. So if knight to d6, I believe white wins. It's a little bit complex, but the basic idea is simple. So first my king comes over, king f3, his king comes over, and now I play c4. Of course he can't take the pawn because then I queen. If he plays g4, protecting his pawn, then I play c5, threatening to take his knight and then queen, so he should retreat. But then I play knight to e3. All 3 of my passers are safe, and I'm going to take on g4 and take the h-pawn and win easily. Alright, so if he plays king to d7, then c5, knight f5 check, I take, he takes, and my king runs up. And once again, we have a position where it's very close, but white does win. So here, check, king c6, f3, and now his knight has no place safe to go, because I'm threatening to play king to d7 next. So he's got to try knight f6. I take, he takes my pawn, but after knight to h5 I win, because I can save my pawn, I can prevent my pawn from being captured, and eventually win the ending. Okay, so it's close, but I win. Now let's look at the variation where we both queen, so that's also kind of fun. Just go back to there. Alright, so instead of knight to d6, black can also try h2. So I queen, he queens. He can try knight c3. After king to d3, it'll come to the same thing. So let's just say he queens straight away. Fortunately here, I have a forced mate. So queen to d7 check. Of course, if he goes to b8, that's terrible. I just play queen c7 and then knight to b6 mate. The other moves are better, but only in the sense they last a couple of moves longer. So if king to a8, queen c6, and if he goes to a7, I go to b6. If he goes to b8, I go to c7, and then the knight goes either to b6 or c7 with mate. Likewise, on king a6, I play queen to c6 check. Next move, whichever way he goes, I go to b6, and then either mate him with queen to b4 if he goes down to a4, or with knight to c7 if he goes to a8. Okay, so that line is again a win for me. Finally, there's knight to f5. And here once again I win. Alright, so I run back into the corner first, king e2, king b6, and now f4, so not letting him use his g-pawns. Knight e7, king f3, king a8, king g2. And what I'm going to do is improve my position here as much as possible, threatening to break in here, or at least be on the verge of breaking in with king to g5. So knight to f5, now knight to c7. Alright, and again, this is about as good as this position can get, but it's not good enough. So knight to f8. Now, if he retreats his knight, I'm going to play king h4, king g5, and he's going to be in trouble. So I will win that in due course. If king to b5, knight g6, king c4, knight h4, f5, and I'm able to win by just pushing his guys back here. So let's say if king takes c3, king h4, and now I can just go up here. And whatever he does, he loses. If he plays king takes f3, of course I just push my f-pawn. If he plays king takes f5, then king f7, e6, and it's always just by a hair that I win, but I win. So that's one variation. If going back here he plays knight takes f5 check, then I play king f6, knight to g5, and e6, and his knight can't stop my e-pawn. I mean, he can give check, excuse me, on g4 or on g8, but I simply move my king. So if knight to g8 check, king f7, knight h6. Actually, let me think about this a little bit here. Okay, yeah, this makes sense here. King g6, knight to g8, and f4. So that should be sufficient. So if he checks, king f6 looks best, and then on this, then here. Okay, yeah, I'm just going around in circles a little bit. So let's see. So back here, knight e7. Okay, king f7 right away. Knight c6, f5, and there shouldn't be any trouble here, but maybe I'm making trouble for myself. No, okay, everything's protected. Or even king to g7. Yeah, king g7. So if he takes, he's way too late. So this looks like it should be a good line here, but maybe I did something a little bit hasty. At any rate, white is winning, and it's just a matter of how much accuracy is needed there to bring the full point home. All right, so all these lines are pretty long. These variations, several variations went 24 moves or 25 moves or thereabouts. So it's no longer a simple win, and that's one of the typical things. The reason why it's important to be very accurate in your endgame technique is because even if you make a move that's not best, but you're still winning afterward, if you do that enough, the winning margin decreases a little bit at a time until finally it's gone, and that's essentially what happened here. So F4, as we saw, doesn't work. Knight to B5 or A6, and then knight to B5, which will transpose, wins, but by a hair in some really long and complicated lines. The move I played, king to E2, gives away the win for good. And the key point is one that I mentioned in the context of F4. So again, to refresh your memory, F4, knight G2, and because the knight gets to stay on F4, he draws, so I no longer can win the E6 pawn and get no attacking possibilities afterwards. So king to E2, knight G2, and here it's too late. So knight to B5, knight F4, king F1, king C6, A6, king B6, A7, king B7, and now there's just no knight to C7, knight E6 stuff. So it means that the position is a draw. He can't make any progress, and I can't either. So king G1, G5, king H2, H4, and now we just kind of go back and forth and wait for the inevitable. So just nothing to do, and draw was agreed after king to G1. I can't try to win, so if I play something like knight to D6 and try to go after, for example, his G5 pawn, bad things will happen. So he's going to take everything. So he's going to play king C4, king C3, king D4, king E5, and if I try to counterattack with something like this, takes, king C4, so no sense in bothering with G5, and then I play F4, maybe get some counterplay. So just go straight for the pawns, king C4, king H4, king C3, king G5, takes, say F4, king E4, and I'm toast. Because his D pawn is going to be much faster than anything that I can muster up with king G6 and then F5. So I'm too late here. So king here, probably best just to play this and make me lose a little bit more time. And this is a pretty routine win. Actually, it's extremely routine because black has queen to H5, so it's not even. I don't even get to put up any resistance. So the queen's going to go to E8 next, and that's the end of that. So back here, I didn't bother with knight to D6. I simply repeated, as I mentioned, and the game was drawn. So a very interesting game. Had a lot of really very diverse and fascinating phases, as I'm sure you'll agree. So we start off with this very interesting opening, and then we get into this kind of peculiar French structure where there's play on both sides of the board, and then it transitioned into this ending where we saw that the technique that was required was kind of this combination of prophylaxis and active moves, and I had some sense of the prophylactic needs in the position, but not quite enough, and Dreev did a nice job and held by a hair. So instructive game for me. Would have been nice if I had beaten him, of course, but happy with the game as it was. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something as well, and I'll see you next week. So thanks a lot. Oh, let me remind everyone, so I have to throw my little ad here, to check out my blog at chessmind.powerblogs.com. There's going to be a newsletter coming out very shortly, and I've also got a lot of coverage of the Vikonsay tournaments as well. So take a look at that, chessmind.powerblogs.com. Thanks again, and good night.